October 11, 1776. A ragged fleet of 15 hastily built ships sits hidden behind a narrow island on a lake most Americans have never heard of. On the other side of that island, a British armada twice their size is hunting them down, led by officers who have never lost a naval battle in their lives. Within hours, almost every American ship will be sunk, burned, or captured. And yet historians will call this one of the most important naval battles in the history of the United States. Not because America won it, because America lost it at exactly the right time. And in doing so, bought something far more valuable than victory: time. And that time would go on to save the entire revolution. This is the story of Benedict Arnold, before he became a traitor, when he was still America's most dangerous and brilliant naval commander, and the battle he fought knowing he could not win, because losing slowly was the only way his country could survive. Let's set the stage, because to understand why a naval battle on a lake most people can't find on a map mattered more than almost any battle of the Revolutionary War, you have to understand exactly what was at stake in the summer of 1776. The American colonies had just declared independence. On paper, this was a bold, historic act of defiance. In reality, it was a declaration made by a country that barely had an army, had almost no navy, and was about to face the full might of the most powerful empire on earth. Britain had just suffered the embarrassment of losing Boston. British forces had been forced to evacuate the city in March of 1776 after George Washington's Continental Army fortified Dorchester Heights and made the British position untenable. That loss stung, and Britain's response was not going to be timid. It was going to be overwhelming. The British strategy for crushing the rebellion quickly involved a masterstroke of geography. If you look at a map of colonial America in 1776, you'll notice something important. The colonies were connected along the Atlantic coast, but inland there was a natural highway running from Canada straight down into the heart of the colonies. That highway was a chain of lakes and rivers: the St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson River, stretching all the way down to New York City. If the British could control this water route, they could effectively cut the rebellious colonies in half. New England, the seedbed of the Revolution, the place where the Sons of Liberty had thrown tea into Boston Harbor, the place where the first shots at Lexington and Concord had been fired, would be isolated from the rest of the colonies. No reinforcements, no supplies, no coordinated resistance. Britain could then crush New England first and mop up the rest of the rebellion at their leisure. This wasn't a minor tactical maneuver. This was potentially the single move that could end the American Revolution before it had really begun. Standing in the way of this plan was Lake Champlain. It's a long, narrow lake stretching more than 100 miles between what is now New York and Vermont, eventually connecting north into Canada. Whoever controlled Lake Champlain controlled the gateway between British Canada and the American colonies. And in the summer of 1776, the British had just been humiliated by an American invasion of Canada the previous year, an invasion that had ultimately failed, but had shown that the Americans were bold enough to strike first. Now the British intended to reverse the flow entirely. General Guy Carleton, the British governor of Quebec, was assembling a massive invasion force at the northern end of Lake Champlain, intending to sail south, retake the lake, and open the corridor into New York. This is where Benedict Arnold enters the story, and it's worth pausing here, because most people today only know one thing about Benedict Arnold. They know he became the most infamous traitor in American history, a name that is still synonymous with betrayal more than 200 years later. But in 1776, Benedict Arnold was not a villain. He was, by a wide margin, one of the most capable, aggressive, and effective military commanders that the fledgling United States possessed. He had helped capture Fort Ticonderoga in a daring surprise raid in 1775. He had led a brutal, grueling march through the wilderness of Maine in an attempt to capture Quebec, an expedition so difficult that his men were reduced to eating candles and boiled leather to survive. He had been wounded leading the assault on Quebec itself. Whatever Arnold would become later, in the summer and fall of 1776, He was one of the most trusted and battle-hardened officers in the entire Continental Army. And it was Arnold who was given an almost impossible task: build a navy from nothing in the wilderness fast enough to stop the British before they could sail south. Think about what that actually required. There was no shipyard. There was no stockpile of naval cannons. There was no trained corps of shipwrights waiting for orders. Arnold had to establish a shipbuilding operation from scratch at a place called Skensborough, at the southern end of Lake Champlain, using green, unseasoned timber cut directly from the surrounding forest, because there was no time to let the wood properly dry and cure the way shipbuilding normally required. He needed blacksmiths, sailmakers, riggers, and carpenters, most of whom had never built a warship before in their lives. He needed cannons hauled in from wherever they could be scrounged. And he needed all of this done in a matter of weeks, not months, because every day that passed was a day closer to the British fleet being ready to sail. And here's the truly staggering part. Arnold pulled it off. Through the summer of 1776, working in brutal conditions, fighting disease, shortages, and the sheer impossibility of the timeline, Arnold's makeshift shipyard produced a fleet. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't powerful by any conventional naval standard. It consisted of small, flat-bottomed gunboats called gondolas and slightly larger vessels called row galleys, along with a few converted schooners and sloops. These were not ships of the line. They were not built for grand naval engagements on the open ocean. They were built for one specific, desperate purpose: to fight a delaying action on a narrow lake, using whatever guns could be mounted on whatever hulls could be built in time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lake, the British were doing something almost unimaginable in scale. General Carleton's forces were not just building small boats. They were disassembling actual full-sized warships in Quebec, hauling the components overland and by water around the rapids of the Richelieu River, and reassembling them on Lake Champlain. This included building an enormous vessel called the Inflexible, a three-masted, square-rigged ship carrying 18 guns, constructed in an almost unbelievable 28 days once the components arrived. The British fleet, when finally assembled, dramatically outgunned and outmanned anything Arnold could hope to field. This was not a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. And Arnold knew it, so why fight at all? This is the strategic brilliance that elevates Arnold's actions at Valcour Island from a footnote into one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. Arnold understood something that many of his contemporaries did not fully grasp. He did not need to win the battle. He needed to survive long enough and inflict enough damage and delay that the British invasion timetable would be pushed past the point where they could realistically continue their campaign before winter set in. If Arnold could force the British to spend weeks building their fleet and then force them to spend more time fighting through his defenses even in defeat, the campaign season would run out. Lake Champlain and the surrounding wilderness become brutally unforgiving once winter arrives. If Carleton's forces could not push all the way to Fort Ticonderoga and beyond before the snow came, the entire invasion would have to be called off until the following spring. And that delay, that single year, was exactly what the fragile American cause desperately needed. By early October of 1776, both fleets were ready. Arnold made a decision that would define the battle. Rather than meeting the British fleet in open water, where their superior firepower and larger ships would have every advantage, Arnold positioned his small fleet in a narrow channel between the western shore of Lake Champlain and a heavily wooded piece of land called Valcour Island. This channel was cramped, difficult to navigate, and largely hidden from a ship sailing south along the main body of the lake. Arnold anchored his vessels in a tight defensive line across this channel, essentially daring the British to come find him, and forcing them to fight in a confined space where their numerical and firepower advantages would be blunted. On the morning of October 11, 1776, the British fleet, sailing south with a following wind, passed by Valcour Island without initially spotting the Americans hidden in the channel. It was only when advanced British scouts finally caught sight of Arnold's fleet that the alarm was raised. And here is where the British made a critical error, because the wind was blowing from the north. and their large ships had already sailed past the mouth of the channel. The British fleet now had to turn and fight their way back against the wind to engage Arnold's position. Larger, more heavily armed vessels like the Inflexible struggled to beat back against the wind and could not immediately bring their full firepower to bear. It was smaller, more maneuverable gunboats that reached the channel first, allowing Arnold's fleet to fight a more even engagement in the opening stages of the battle than the overall numbers would have suggested. What followed was hours of brutal, close-range naval combat. Cannon fire tore through wooden hulls at point-blank distance. Arnold personally commanded from his flagship, a galley called the Congress, moving between vessels, directing fire, and reportedly working one of the cannons himself at points during the battle. The noise alone must have been staggering. A continuous rolling thunder of cannon fire echoing off the wooded shores of the lake, thick clouds of gray gunsmoke drifting low over the water, obscuring ships from each other for moments at a time. Men were killed and wounded on both sides. Ships were battered, their rigging shredded, their hulls holed. One of Arnold's vessels, a schooner called the Royal Savage, ran aground early in the fighting and was eventually captured and burned by the British. Another, a gondola called the Philadelphia, was so badly damaged that it sank later that evening, its wreck settling to the bottom of the lake where, astonishingly, it would remain remarkably preserved for nearly 2 centuries before being rediscovered. By the time darkness fell on October 11th, Arnold's fleet had taken tremendous punishment. Ships were damaged, ammunition was running desperately low, and casualties had mounted. By any conventional measure, the battle had gone badly for the Americans. But Arnold was not finished, because the fight itself was never really the objective. Survival, and the delay that survival would purchase, was the objective. And so, under cover of darkness and a providential fog that settled over the lake, Arnold did something the British commanders considered almost impossible. He ordered his surviving ships to quietly slip their anchors, and in single file, without lights, without sound, they threaded their way directly past the anchored British fleet, hugging the shoreline in the darkness, and escaped south down the lake completely undetected. When the British awoke the following morning to discover that the American fleet had simply vanished from the channel during the night, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief followed by furious pursuit. The chase that followed over the next several days was almost as dramatic as the battle itself. Arnold's battered, leaking ships struggled southward, harried constantly by a faster and more powerful British fleet now bearing down on them with full knowledge of their position. On October 13th, near Split Rock, the British finally caught up with the remnants of Arnold's fleet. What followed was less a battle than a running execution. Ship after American ship was overtaken, battered into submission, and either captured or deliberately run aground and burned by their own crews to prevent capture. Arnold himself, aboard the Congress, fought a desperate rearguard action, allowing other vessels to escape, before finally running his own flagship aground in a shallow bay, setting it ablaze with the flag still flying, and leading his surviving men on a harrowing overland march through hostile wilderness back to the safety of Fort Ticonderoga. By any measure, the Battle of Valcour Island and the running battle that followed was a decisive American defeat. Arnold had lost almost his entire fleet. Dozens of men were dead. It should have been, by every conventional definition, a disaster. And yet, here is the payoff. The reason this battle is remembered and studied more than 2 centuries later. General Carleton, despite his overwhelming victory, made a fateful decision. Rather than pressing his advantage immediately and pushing south toward Fort Ticonderoga while he still had the momentum, Carleton chose to consolidate his position, assess the damage his own fleet had taken, and cautiously advance. By the time British forces finally approached Fort Ticonderoga in late October, the season had turned. Winter was closing in fast on the wilderness of upstate New York. Faced with the prospect of laying siege to a fortified American position in brutal winter conditions, far from his supply lines, Carleton made the decision to withdraw his entire invasion force back north into Canada, postponing the campaign until the following year. This is the entire point. This is why Arnold's sacrifice mattered. He had not won the battle. He had won the calendar. He had bought an entire winter, an entire season for the American cause to regroup, to reorganize, to strengthen its defenses and to prepare. And what happened during that bought time changed the entire trajectory of the war. The following year, in 1777, when the British finally launched their renewed invasion south from Canada under General John Burgoyne, following essentially the same strategic corridor that Carleton had been forced to abandon, the Americans were ready in a way they simply would not have been a year earlier. That campaign culminated in the battles of Saratoga, where American forces, reinforced, better organized, and battle-hardened by the intervening months, achieved a stunning and complete victory, forcing an entire British army to surrender. Saratoga is widely regarded by historians as the true turning point of the American Revolutionary War, the victory that finally convinced France that the American cause was viable enough to justify open military alliance. And French intervention, with its money, its navy, and eventually its army, proved absolutely decisive in ultimately winning American independence. Trace that chain of events backward, link by link, and it leads directly back to a narrow, smoke-filled channel beside a wooded island on Lake Champlain, and a fleet of hastily built gunboats that had no real chance of winning, but bought exactly the time that history needed. There's a haunting irony sitting at the heart of this story that is impossible to ignore. The man who built that fleet from nothing, who fought with such tactical brilliance and personal courage that even his enemies openly admired his conduct that day, who arguably did more than almost any single officer to save the American cause in its most vulnerable hour, was the very same Benedict Arnold who would, just 4 years later, attempt to betray West Point to the British and become the most reviled name in American history. It's a reminder that history rarely deals in simple heroes and villains. The same courage, the same brilliance, the same audacity that saved the revolution at Valcour Island lived inside the same man who would later try to destroy it. Understanding Arnold requires holding both of these truths at once, and Valcour Island stands as perhaps the clearest proof of just how much this complicated, brilliant, and ultimately tragic figure gave to a cause he would later try to betray. Today, if you were to visit Lake Champlain, you would find a peaceful, scenic body of water, popular with boaters and vacationers, largely unaware of the violence that once tore across its surface. But beneath those calm waters lie the wrecks of Arnold's fleet, remarkably preserved wooden ships resting on the lake bottom, silent witnesses to one of the most consequential naval defeats in American history. Divers and archaeologists have explored several of these wrecks over the decades, including the Philadelphia, which was actually raised from the lake bottom in 1935 and can now be viewed at the Smithsonian Institution, its timbers still scarred by cannon fire from that October day in 1776. So what do we take from the Battle of Valcour Island more than 2 centuries later? Perhaps it's this: victory and success are not always the same thing. Sometimes the most important contribution you can make is not to win outright, but to hold the line just long enough, to buy just enough time, for something greater to become possible. Benedict Arnold lost nearly every ship under his command that October, and in doing so, he may have saved the American Revolution. History rarely rewards us with clean, simple stories, and Valcour Island reminds us that the line between defeat and strategic triumph can be thinner and far more consequential than we ever imagine. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Benedict Arnold deserves to be remembered first and foremost as the brilliant naval commander who helped save the American Revolution at Valcour Island? Or does his later betrayal permanently overshadow everything he accomplished before it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I would genuinely love to hear how you see this incredibly complicated figure in American history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most underrated battles of the American Revolution, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss the next story from the history that shaped our world. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next one.